Hello, welcome to the Paddock Pass Podcast presented by Renthal Street Clip-On Handlebars, premium race spec clip-ons developed by some of the world's fastest riders. On today's Paddock Pass Podcast, the first of 2022, we've actually got a special guest. We've got Mat Oxley on to talk about his new book of Valentino Rossi, All His Races. So as usual on the pod, we've got Adam, Neil, David, and like I said, Matt as a special guest. And Neil, obviously, you've been globetrotting the last couple of weeks, Northern Ireland, Spain, Scotland. You've just about managed to avoid the dreaded plague as well.
Exactly, Steve. Yeah, I went back to Plague Island for about 3 weeks, had more close contacts than hot dinners, I think, in that time, and somehow managed to stay COVID-free. So, yeah, counting my blessings being back here in one piece. I don't believe Mr. Oxley was quite so fortunate over Christmas.
I was going to say...
we all went down with it, with the plague, all four of us, me, my wife, and the two kids. But, Omicron, it was, because I'm super fit and healthy and a sort of, high-performing athlete, it didn't affect me too much.
I was going to say, Matt, it was basically just the fact that I managed to catch you whenever you were clearly at the height of your COVID fever that you agreed to come on for pod in the first place.
Yeah, I was tripping, man. I just basically drank my way through the whole thing, really. That was the only way to numb the pain.
David, Neil's after mentioning there all the lateral flows he would have done. It must have just brought you back to your college days, just putting things up your nose.
Well, yeah. I mean, I couldn't afford the stuff that I put on my nose, so mostly it was little pieces of blotting paper. But apart from that, it was fine. So far, I've managed to avoid the dreaded plague by the simple method of not communicating with people, not actually liking people or wanting to be around them. It's extremely effective at keeping away all sorts of diseases.
Yeah, I think you're probably the only person in the world that's been really happy with the last couple of years. They've managed to keep the contacts down, managed to avoid a lot of travel. And what about you? Obviously, Supercross back in action at the weekend, so you pretty much straight back to work at the start of the year.
Yeah, obviously Dakar as well, Steve. Trying to drum up the enthusiasm for motorcycle racing really after the sort of the lunacy of the end of the last season. We were kind of isolated in terms of avoiding coronavirus here in Spain. An 11th-hour trip back to the UK was called off, and it meant 3 stints with the in-laws. So I was suffering my own kind of delirium then after that, but it wasn't too bad. Thankfully, they don't speak such great English. So, but my wife does, so I could be in trouble. I have to be a bit careful. But no, it's good to have the new year starting again. Of course, everything's kicking off, and it's only a couple of weeks till Sepang, and it all starts again.
Well, I'll tell you what, you mentioned Dakar there. Obviously enough, we have to give a bit of a mention for Dakar, obviously, with Danilo Petrucci doing such a good job on it. And Matt, you were sitting down for an interview with Danilo about going to do the Dakar as well, just in the end of the season.
Yeah, obviously he's a dirt rider, so you thought, he'll be all right at that. But he's been just astonishing, really. Absolutely astonishing, because obviously it isn't just riding; it's the whole navigation thing, which isn't easy, especially when you're in the desert. When everything looks the same for sort of as far as the eye can see in either direction. I think he's done amazingly well. But the thing to remember about him, and I'm in no way taking away any of his achievement, is that he is a dirt rider at heart. He was motocrossing from the age of whatever until he was 16, but he didn't actually start road racing to 16. So he is 100% a dirt rider, which is why he's kind of always ridden quite the road racing bike's quite loose. You know what I mean? He's you come from that background. But yeah, he's been phenomenal, and it's just great to see, because he's just a top man. Absolutely.
I think you said it well then, Matt, because if you saw, I think there was a post by Sam Sunderland, who's currently leading the rally. By the time this podcast is out, God knows what have happened to him on the gas. But he made this Instagram post where he showed a copy of his road book. It's basically just a bunch of crowded symbols, hieroglyphics, and through a Red Bull event 3 years ago now, just out here in Spain, I was able to do like a bit of a road book course with him and go riding, through some parts of the countryside, and trying to actually ride quite quickly while watching where you're going. And my road book was basic; it was ABC. And looking at that image he posted on Instagram, I think, how the can they actually do that while tapping out these 450s at sort of 120k? So it's it is impressive. I think Danilo's achievements have to be qualified a little bit by the sad demise of his aspirations for finishing up the standings. I mean, he's to all intents and purposes out of the rally, out of the competition. But it does give him the ideal opportunity then to get some experience and just not have to worry about thinking, oh, am I 5th, am I 6th, am I 1st or 28th this particular day. So I do wonder if some of the competitors, people like Adrian Van Beveren, who's a fantastic motocrosser as well, really good sand riders, won a lot of beach races, they kind of look at some of the attention that Danilo's created for the rally, which has been great, but think, well, I've been busting my ass for 5 years trying to win this thing. So it's but no, it's good to see, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it shows certainly the level at which all of these riders are. But I mean, like Matt, you said that Danilo's a bit of a dirt rider. Pretty much all of them are dirt riders, really. I mean, every time Adam turns up to a MotoGP race when Andrea Dovizioso's there, Dovizioso, who doesn't like speaking to journalists, basically corners him and he's asking him everything there is to know about MXGP. A lot of them, I think Bradley Smith was the same, grew up racing motocross, but at some point had to make a choice and decided to go and ride sort of on the road. Or on tracks, and so it's not really surprising. It's just kids generally start off riding motocross, and then transition onto tracks. But I mean, what I've been impressed most is as you say, the navigation skills. It's just stunning. You need so much intelligence to be able to ride these that kind of a course, and I think that's where he's excelled.
Yeah, because I think for me, one of the most exciting things with it is it's a bit like JD Beach over in the US, being able to win races in AFT and flat tracks and then going out to race Moto America, win super sport races, be competitive on a superbike. It's nice to see a bit of a throwback to riders being able to do these different championships. You look at Peter Hickman, he's managed to resurrect his career, basically make himself into a professional rider just by being able to do the TT. Petrucci's obviously a rider. And Neil, you know this from when you first came into the paddock, and he just transformed himself from the rider that was on a stock 1,000 bike in the superbike paddock to then being on a CRT bike to then turn himself into a Grand Prix winner.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just another chapter in Petrucci's amazing story. I think all of us would have the similar opinion that he stood out just because he didn't have that normal path through the Grand Prix categories. And, he wasn't being hailed as the next Marc Marquez when he was 16 years old. He, I think, basically had to convince himself as much as anything, really, in those early years in the CRT class that he belonged there. He would say quite often that he was riding around at the back of the field thinking, what am I doing here? This isn't my field. And to come from that to, building himself up to two-time MotoGP race winner, factory Ducati rider, was in 2019 was third in the championship or second in the championship throughout the first part of that season. It was a pretty remarkable story. And ultimately, he wasn't maybe good enough to go on and win a MotoGP championship, but still what he has achieved, I think, until now in his career. And there's still obviously going to be some further chapters added, maybe with some success in the Dakar in years to come, perhaps. It's just another part of this remarkable kind of story that he's had.
I think also we see it in car racing where drivers who've been doing Formula One for ages suddenly realize that what they want to do is kind of do the classics, so they've obviously been a Formula One driver, so they suddenly realize they want to do the Indy 500, they want to do the Le Mans 24 hour, they want to do those real kind of adventurous races that have been, that are such a huge part of motorsport history. And I think somebody like Petrucci, doing something like, he's run a MotoGP, he's won a Dakar stage, he hasn't won a Dakar yet, but, and then he could go off and do a Le Mans 24 hour or something and win the Le Mans 24 hours. So you're just kind of, you're just really sucking as much out of the sport as you can, rather than just whizzing round and round and round in circles under vicious pressure in MotoGP or Formula One. You're actually going out and doing something a little bit more adventurous, a little bit more different, a little, sort of actually just sort of spreading yourself around a bit, which I think is great.
It's interesting as well, Matt, because obviously in the superbike paddock, we only have 13 rounds a year, much shorter calendar than what you have in the GP paddock. And all of the riders look forward to doing Suzuka. They all want to go to something completely different. They want to go to a race where they're up against Grand Prix riders. They want to be able to prove themselves on a more level playing field, because whenever any of the superbike riders jump into GP, it's usually here's the bike 2 days earlier, get yourself fitted onto it, make sure you're all right. And then, you're in at the deep end. Whereas for Suzuka, they feel that when you're up against a Grand Prix rider, you can actually show the full level of your championship and your talents as well. So it's always interesting whenever everyone gets that chance. But obviously enough, Matt, we did bring you onto the pod to talk about your new book, Valentino Rossi, All His Races. And this is your second book you've written about Rossi as well. But this was a bit of a task. There's been quite a few races, and you even went all the way back to his European Championship days.
Yeah, I think so. I've forgotten. I think it's 445 races in all. So I think that's 400 and something Grand Prix, 2 Suzuka 8 hours, and then 11 rounds of the 1995 European Championship. So I mean, yeah, it's been it was a big job, and I was kind of wondering when I would get paid. So I kind of looked back at my contract, which I signed. I thought, I wonder when I signed that. November 2015, I signed the contract to write that book. So it's kind of been sort of 5-6 years. Obviously, the kind of panic growing slightly as we got closer to the kind of deadline. Never really knowing when he was going to retire. But I was so, I don't really get paid until the book comes out. So I was like, "You bastard, retire! Come on!" So I remember when there was sort of, all last season, it's like, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? Is he going to stay? Is he going to go? And I was like, oh, for God's sake, just retire. Go on. But so when he did, yes. And I can finish the bloody book after 5-6 years, and B, I can get some money in the bank account. Yeah, the funny things that basically these are the things that drive us, aren't they? Getting your work finished and getting the money done.
Yeah, I mean, this industry is notorious for taking a very long time to pay, but I don't think I've ever had to wait 6 years to get paid for something. What was the most difficult part to actually research? Because you were talking about the European races. His Grand Prix career is quite well documented also because he was really successful right from the start. But his European Championship races, I mean, how much coverage was there of those races in that time? Obviously, very, very little. I mean, it would have been probably 2016. Right? I went to, before the Italian Grand Prix, I went to the offices of Motorsprint, the Italian weekly, and went through. Obviously, when you're doing these sort of things, you have to be a bit sort of surreptitious and sort of not really tell people what you're up to. You don't march in and say, "I'm writing a book about Rossi. Can I have a look through your files?" You just say, "Oh, I'm sort of thinking about writing a story about his European Championship." Yeah, And so I went through all of the Motorsprints for that year, just when he was starting to get coverage, and then got on with the FIM, who basically had nothing, just the championship results, just points graph, the chart. That's all they had. So that was. But then I interviewed people like Lucio Cecchinello, who was obviously his main rival, Rossi's main rival in the European Championship. So he remembered a lot of it. And then I interviewed a couple of other riders that were in the championship that year. So that was probably, from a point of view of actually finding out what had happened, that was actually the most difficult part. I mean, everything else is pretty well documented. And I've written Grand Prix reports on pretty much every race, on the days that he raced them. So, a lot of it was going back through old reports but that's kind of quite tricky because what was important then isn't important now, and what wasn't important then is important now. You know what I mean? You're writing it from a different perspective. You're not sort of so you have to be careful not to get sort of bogged down in you've got to really sort of dilute everything and really get everything to the point where you're telling a story, that it's not just a one race report after another, and then they went to Assen, and then they went to Sachsenring. So you have to keep the thing dancing along. You know what I mean?
How did you pace yourself writing it, Matt? Were you kind of writing everything once the season had finished? Were you going every week and doing a little bit after each GP? I mean, how did you kind of pace yourself? Were you leaving it all to the very last minute, or had you sort of paced yourself quite well?
I'm quite good at sort of getting stuck in. If I've got some work to do, I'll get on with it. I'd rather do the work and go down the pub afterwards and go down the pub and sit there fretting about getting the work done. You know what I mean? So I started it in 2016, and obviously, you know, first season 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998, 1989, 1999, and the kind of the pace of the work kind of got faster and faster as we got closer and closer to knowing that he's going to retire. So I do most of the stuff in the winters generally, and then the last year or so, I was really having to, you know, coming back from every Grand Prix, but then it's not only the writing, it's the subbing the bloody thing afterwards, and you know, it gets designed, and then you've got to correct things and change the design around, and so it's people, unless you've written a book, you just have no bloody idea what a nightmare it is, you know. And by the time you get to the end of it, you're so bored of it. You know, when it arrives, when you see the book, and you're like, oh, great, but you're so bored, sick of the sight of the thing, really. You've seen every page 100 times. You've read every word 50 times. You know, anyway. But it's out now, and now I'm waiting for the check, so that's the important thing.
I mean, I don't think any of us could really, well, nobody could have predicted the kind of career Rossi had. And I just wanted to ask each of us on the podcast, starting with you, Matt, what was your kind of impressions of this motorcycle racer in the formative years? Did you get an inkling that, you know, this could be somebody that you would be writing a book around, or two books? You know, especially when it came to doing the first one. You know, what was your, I don't know,
I think so. He turned up in 1996. And straight away was pretty fast, and fairly quickly we kind of realized that, because he used to come up to the media center on Sunday evenings and spend an hour just chatting and laughing and joking with Italian journalists and us or whatever, you know, which was, you know, what other rider does that? I mean, who's ever known a rider that comes up and spends half an hour in the media center on a Saturday having a laugh with the journalists? I mean, it's just completely unique. So you go like, wow, this guy's a bit different, and then he's getting faster and faster, and then you turn up at Imola. I think it was it Imola 96? I think it must have been, and there was just the Rossi mania had started, and the banks across from the start finish were full of all these people wearing stuff, and it was like, wow, you know, this is something different. But obviously you never know. Lots of people can ride 125s, you know, and then they get on a 250 and they're not so good. Lots of people can ride 250s and then they got on a 500, and you know, it doesn't work. But he was, I think, by the time he got onto 250s, it was pretty obvious, and he was just straight away bang. I think he broke the lap record at Jerez in his first test on the thing, you know, and you were like, whoa, you know, this guy, there was no doubt that he was very special.
I mean, because he was a 2-year man, wasn't he? He took 1 year to learn the class and then win it the second. And for me, I think I really started to notice him, you know, being the official Aprilia rider in the 250s. You know, because I think he was part of that gaggle of the Italian, Spanish riders that were quite prevalent through the junior classes in you know, the mid 90s, late 90s. But it was a time when, you know, I think he made the step out of the 250s, got on that very kind of distinctive NSR 500. You know, and I think, you know, that time in the 500s, there was a bit of a dearth of Italian and Spanish talent. There wasn't a great deal of them. I mean, let's not forget, I mean, Italian Grand Prix winners of that period, you had Pierfrancesco Chili taking a couple of freaky wins. Luca Cadalora was there or thereabouts. You know, Italy didn't really have a great champion or like icon in that series, did they? So he came along, like, I guess, many great sporting stories at exactly the right time.
Yeah. I mean, and he came in at the end of the kind of Australian American domination, you know, which started obviously with Roberts in '78, and from 1978 till 1999 till 2000. How many European world champions are there? Uncini, Lucanelli, and Crevier. So that's 3 years. They all won one championship each, and that's in 78, 88, in 23 years. I think there's something like that. It's like 20 out of 23 world championships were won by Australians or Americans. You know, I mean, just the Europeans would, until the Big Bang engine came in and tires developed, you know, and people could ride them in line with the wheels in line instead of sideways. That was when the Europeans came back. So yeah, Rossi has that kind of almost sort of supernatural way of just things working in his favour. He's had a lot of that. Not always. He's had a lot of that through his career.
Yeah, because I think for me, like I remember when we first got Sky in the house, that would have been in '99, and the first race that we had it for was actually Imola. That was when we had the Tricolore on the 250. So you instantly saw a pretty cool looking bike, and then we're drawn towards him. But what I found really interesting was when I was doing some of the classic races with Nick Harris for Dorna a couple of years ago, we did a big Rossi series. We did all the ones like his first win, 250 wins, different things like this, lots of different races. But what I thought was the most interesting one was Austria in '96. So he was a rookie, brand new track for everyone. The place absolutely flooded for practice. And as the weekend progressed, you could actually see from the footage, he was trying different things to everyone else on the grid. He was taking different lines everywhere compared to everyone else. And when you look at that field, like how impressive it was, you had still an Aspar race, and you had all those Japanese riders that were just at the end of that Japanese dominance of the lightweight class. And you had this 16-year-old kid that was just taking a different approach to everywhere. And it just looked, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, looking at it, I don't know, this would be in 2018, we did it. You're looking back and you're keeping an eye on Rossi anyway. But you see that he was doing things no one else was doing. And it was only his, 8th, 9th Grand Prix. He went out, got his first podium then that weekend. And, like you said, Matt, like at the time, the big story that weekend would have been Ivan Goy winning a race. We never really saw Ivan again after that. Whereas with Rossi, that became the big thing.
Yeah, when obviously his first deal was signed, I think at the end of '94 with Carlo Pernat from Aprilia. And Pernat said that when he went to watch Rossi the first time, Rossi's dad was saying, "Come and watch my son, he's really fast." And I think it was possibly Virginio Ferrari, I think, or Aldo Drudi, who finally convinced Pernat to go and watch this young kid who had just started riding 125 GP bikes in the Italian Championship. And he sort of said when he first watched him, he didn't know whether he was an idiot or a genius, because he was just taking all these weird lines, running off the track. And he was like, wow, there's something different about this guy, but I'm not actually sure, whether he is a genius or an idiot. He really wasn't sure because he was so unusual, doing everything so different. You're like, well, yeah, you're doing it different, but does that mean that's the good way to do things, or are you just being and after a while he did decide that he was a genius, right then, straight away, and went back to Ivan Beggio and said, I want to sign this guy on a 3-year contract, 15,000 euros first year, 30,000 euros the second year, 60,000 the third year, something like that. And Beggio went, "You're mad. Who is this kid?" But so Pernat, he's had a lot of, he's managed to convince people all the way through his career, and I've got some other stories, interesting stories about Rossi in his early days with Pernat. I'll tell you later.
Oh, that's a good tease. That's a good tease. And with that tease, we're going to cut to an ad break. So when we come back, we'll probably hear one or two of those stories from that. Welcome back to the Paddock Pass Podcast, presented by Fly Racing in Renthal Street. So, David, we're still waiting for your first impressions of Rossi when you were watching it back home.
Well, I mean, I remember watching World Superbikes at the time because 500s were incredibly tedious because it was Mick Doohan, and Mick Doohan seemed to exude an absolute lack of joy in everything he did, and he was an incredible racer, but it was just no fun to watch Grand Prix. Also because it was he didn't just take joy in beating the opposition; he took joy in crushing the opposition, and Rossi was the antithesis of that. And I remember, I suppose, like in 125s, I probably started taking notice of him in maybe 97, when he started winning a lot and started just being fun. I mean, obviously there was the Claudia Schiffer thing with the riding around with a blow-up doll on the back of your bike. That gets your attention. And then moving up to 250s. And at the time I was working with someone who was a big Max Biaggi fan. And so sort of once that sort of, that rivalry, then obviously I was going to take the side of Valentino.
Have you ever given this Max Biaggi fan a slap?
Oh yeah, no. I would just
what
sort
are
of
you doing with your
go in
life?
every Monday and point
this?
out they'd just been beaten. They'd just been beaten again. So it was, it was. yeah, it was just the fact he seemed to bring like joy to racing. It was fun to watch him, and that was what really sort of turned me on. Because like at the time, World Superbikes was fantastic. You had Fogarty, and you had people like Bostrom, and you had characters. You had
Slight
Aaron Slight. Yeah, exactly. There was
Scott Russell.
Yeah. And of course the dressing gown incident. I mean, what more can you want? That was exactly what was missing from Grand Prix at the time. Valentino Rossi brought that back.
What about you, Neil?
Yeah, similar stuff to what's been mentioned already, but I think he obviously was very clever when he was a younger guy. He knew how to attract attention. He knew how to exude a kind of a sense of fun, which I think was quite natural to him at the time. That got him attention, that got him a lot of love. He sort of, I never really saw much of his racing at the time, live, just because you had to have like a sort of expensive Sky package to watch the GPs back in the kind of mid to late 90s. But he obviously targeted Max Biaggi. He knew how to wind him up, and I guess that brought a sort of global attention towards GPs, especially in 2000 and 2001, whenever that went to like the 500cc World Championship. Just turned it into this massive thing, which kind of, I don't think 500 GPs had that sort of attention in a long, long time. Like you're also saying, his kind of racing style was fun. I remember really first watching him when he arrived in the 500 class in 2000, and there was a lot of races that year when he was a rookie in the class and he was qualifying way down, or he was starting really poorly. I seem to remember racing in the Sachsenring where he basically came out of the first corner like second last, managed to fight his way through to the front. There was this kind of sense of just anything can happen, anything is possible in the races that he's riding. And you hadn't seen that before, maybe ever in the 500 class, not certainly in kind of racing that I'd been watching. So there was fun off the bike, and there was also a sense of just anything is possible on it.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that you say that, because back then that was before they changed the Sachsenring, and overtaking was even more difficult at that stage, and you were able to see him come through like that. But what I wanted to know, Matt, as well, is just like listening to David and Neil talking about that sense of fun that you got from Rossi. You're very unique in the perspective you can give from Rossi in those early years, especially his first couple of years on a 500 when he was living in London. You had a much better relationship with him than pretty much any journalist would have had, especially any English journalist, any non-Italian.
When did I write my first book about him? End of 2001. Well, during 2001, I suppose, when it was, he was going to win the championship and everything, so he was living in London, dodging tax, and so I used to go and see him. He had this service department in this really kind of really horrible service department in St James's Square, which is a kind of very posh part of London, but it was a pretty grim little apartment. It went into it wasn't flash at all. He sort of went into this thing and up in the lift, and there it was, and really badly decorated, and he'd be in there, and he had sort of the trophy from his last race would be stuck on but basically nothing else. He obviously didn't really live there, he was a tax dodge. And one time I remember Lucio being asleep on the sofa, snoring on the sofa while I was interviewing Rossi, because they used to go clubbing a lot. They're both into that kind of side of things quite a lot, I think. He was just completely different. I mean, just talking about the difference from Doohan. I mean, I knew Doohan a lot better because I used to work for his PR guy, so I used to go and see him from Suzuka 1990 till the end of his career. I went to see him every single day in his motorhome, and so I knew him pretty well. And he was. Yeah, he had this. He was a machine, I mean, I'd just go and just crush everyone else and just destroy everyone else, and he'd have them all beaten before he got on the bike, But I've sort of found that fascinating in itself. But the interesting thing is that racers, and probably the same in other sports, basically everyone watches the guy that's winning or the woman that's winning and says, right, that's what I'm going to do. This is obviously the right way to go about your business. So Doohan being very dour and serious, and he made everybody else like that. The whole paddock said, right, well, I'm going to, and so all the people trying to beat him were like him. They sort of, right, okay, I'm going to become really, completely tunnel vision. I'm not going to smile. I'm just, you know what I mean? This is just a job of work and blah, blah, blah. And then, so when Rossi turned up, he just completely changed that whole thing. And suddenly, he's sort of waving at the camera and everything. And suddenly everybody else sort of starts changing as well. And they all start waving at the camera. They're like, oh, that's the way to do it, and of course it is. It's much easier to do something if you enjoy it, I mean, Doohan was getting his enjoyment, but he got his enjoyment out of basically killing people, basically. Yeah. Rossi got his enjoyment out of toying with them and then killing them. I mean, the thing is that all of the waving at the camera and the, what a lovely guy he is, and he is, he's a nice guy, but, he's merciless. He's a vicious, nasty bastard when it comes to racing, because you don't win 9 world championships by being a nice bloke. When he first started, I mean, I interviewed a lot of people kind of behind his career for the book, and Pernat, who ran him for 4 years at Aprilia. So at the end of his first year in 125s, Pernat said, we want you to go straight to 250s. And Rossi said, no, I want to stay on 125s and win the 125s. And they said, no, we want you to go to 250s. And he said, no, well, I'm leaving then. I'm out of here, So, I mean, so he was, 17 then, maybe 18. Even then, he was laying down the law and knew his power. And at the end, for his first 250 season, when they had Harada and Caparossi in the 250 team, well, they had to run 3 different teams to try and keep the thing under control. They had Rossi, Caparossi, and Harada in 3 different factory teams, and Pernat decided which crew chief would work with which rider, and he decided that Rossano Brazzi would work with Caparossi, and it was all sorted out. Yeah, Caparossi's going to ride with Brazzi, and then some point in the winter, Rossi turns up at Aprilia, knocks on Pernat's door, goes in and said, I want Brazzi. I can't remember who he was going to have, but he said, I don't want my crew chief, I want Brazzi. And Pernat said, it's not possible. Caparossi, Loris is having Brazzi. And he said, well, no, I want Brazzi. He says, no, can't do it. I'm sorry. And Rossi said, right, well, I'm out. I'm leaving Aprilia. So Pernat's like, oh my God, okay, so you can have Brazzi. And then he rings up Caparossi. He says, no, Loris, I've been thinking, I'm actually not sure that Brazzi's the best guy for you. I think that you will work better with this other. And Loris says, you really? He said, okay, yeah, maybe you're right. Okay, yeah, let's do that. And Pernat didn't tell him what had happened for like 20 years. It's probably about 5 years ago, a few years ago, he told him, said, by the way, Loris, I stitched you up on your crew. And Caparossi's like, you bastard. So, right from the very beginning, Rossi was completely unerring, knew exactly what he wanted and didn't take any shit from anyone. And so this whole kind of lovable, oh, I'm just having fun kind of, is he's having fun, but man, he is absolutely ruthless in getting what he wants. And, that's, if you're not like that, you're never going to win 9 world titles.
If anything, Matt, is there like a negative side to what Rossi's, the impact he's had on the sport? The impact he's had on the sport's been tremendous. I mean, let's not, paint that a different color. But, that kind of manipulation or those power games that, he was quite prominent in. I mean, I guess the real peak point of it was around Sepang in 2015, where there was a big division, in the paddock, in the sport itself, with Marc Marquez. Rossi wasn't painted in the best light, depending on your viewpoint of the incidents of that season. But, was there a way that, MotoGP became too much VR46?
Well, I mean, for quite a while, yeah. I mean, he was, arguably more important than the sport, and try to think of any other sport where that has been the situation. I mean, was that the situation in boxing when Ali was around? Maybe, I don't know. Was Ali bigger than boxing? Quite possibly. But Rossi was certainly bigger than MotoGP for a while. But I mean, that started that kind of the sort of football fan kind of style thing. He kind of brought that in, and that just because of the intensity of the idolization of his fans. That straight away when he came to 500s, you go to Mugello and there'll be all the Biaggi supporters wearing red and then all the Rossi supporters wearing yellow, and that was like, wow, we're sort of in football. So that was right obvious from that time. And yeah, I mean, I find the whole idolization thing pretty weird. You know, by all means support someone, but why would you idolize anyone? You know, especially a sports person. It's just a sports person. You know, they're not actually doing anything useful or important. You know, they might be fun and entertaining, all that, but yeah, I think from that point. But is that his fault? You know, well, it is, yeah, because he's obviously has a very attractive persona and people love him and they adore him and they idolize him. Does that then make the fans behave in a bad way? Yeah, it probably does. Yeah, I think so. And I think, yeah, the whole 215 thing I don't want to get into here, but yeah, it all got a bit ugly and left a really bad taste. You know, we still feel it now, you know, which is why we don't want to go into it on this podcast. Maybe we should have a 2015 podcast.
Yeah, so there was
definitely that kind of negative side to it. And I think obviously it also happened, you know, the growth of social media, which amplifies all those things, you know. So you know, I think it's a kind of perfect storm of this kind of us and them, the kind of Rossi versus Marquez or Rossi versus Biaggi, and then you stick social media on top of that, and it's get quite ugly.
Just going back, you know, to the start or the early years of Rossi's career, Matt. You know, when I started working in the paddock, Rossi, you would see him in debriefs, and he was personable and charismatic, and gave you sometimes great material to work with. But aside from that, he cut himself off really from the media. You know, he tried to limit media interactions to a minimum. You wouldn't really hear of Rossi giving out interviews unless it was like a special occasion. But you were in a kind of unique position in that you were working, I think you were ghostwriting his column for a couple of magazines back when he was in 250s, perhaps in 98, 99. And, you know, just before he became a global superstar, you know, what was he like when he was a kind of teenager? Was he as kind of happy and fun and carefree as he came across when he was racing on track?
Yeah, I think he was then. But, you know, obviously, like I just said, there's two sides to him. You know, everybody has two different sides to them, don't they? So yeah, obviously he's a ruthless racer. But so I used to go and hunt him down either on the Thursday at a race or on the Sunday evening at a race, depending. And we'd talk about what he'd been up to since the last race. And he was great. He was really into electric radio controlled cars, and you know, he used to go clubbing quite a bit, so we'd talk about music and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, he was just a bubbly kid, very sociable, you know. So he was definitely fun to be with. You know, you could have a real laugh with him because he was just laughing all the time. You know, everything he did, just, you know. So he was, but then yeah, absolutely. As time went on, he kind of withdrew, and you know, he had to. And I can remember various times, and you've probably seen it as well. Not so much recently, because again, he sort of keeps himself out of it. But 10, 20 years ago, used to see him at some event or whatever, and he'd all be like sunny, you know, having fun, and you know, there'd be loads of fans around, and then just suddenly his face would change. And a darkness would kind of come across his face, and he's just like, I've had enough of this. I want to get the fuck out of here. You know, you just see his face just switch like that, just like, this is enough. I'm out of here. And his face would go from sunny and everything to really dark and quite scary. You know, which is probably the face that you know, that's probably what happens to his face when he flicks the visor down. You know.
Yeah, because it's interesting as well, Matt, because you see that with a lot of successful riders, athletes, whatever it is. If they're given a 15-minute window for an interview, you can be very switched on for 15 minutes. And then the second it goes to 15 minutes and 1 second, it's like, right, you've had your time, you haven't got your job done, I'm out of here. And it's interesting with Rossi, especially because you mentioned there about, you know, whenever he was younger, going clubbing, being very personable. But that was also when he didn't have to work as hard. Yeah. He was the best in the world by a massive margin. And, you know, everything came easy for him. He could roll out of bed 5 minutes before warm-up and still set the times. Whereas as he got older, and, you know, you're looking at the time when Dave started coming into the paddock in around 2009, 2010. I started coming in 2012, Neil, a couple of years after that. Obviously, Adam was there from the start of the four-stroke era. But you look at that transition where suddenly he had to work so much harder. So he had to change who he was as well with every side of himself.
Oh, definitely. I mean, two factors: A, that the competition was getting stronger, and B, racing never since the beginning of the dawn of time, it's just got more and more complicated, and I was talking to Petrucci about this, how they do 2 45-minute sessions a day or whatever, so that's an hour and a half on the bike, probably an hour and 10 minutes because they're in and out the pits and so on. But then they're probably looking at a computer screen for another 3-4 hours, maybe more. It's insane. And so the pressures on these guys are huge. They don't get any free time. I mean, if you said right to me, you can be a Grand Prix rider now, I'd be like, I don't think I want to be a MotoGP rider now. I think it's such a job of work. I don't think it's a lot of fun anymore. So, and that comes across. I remember speaking to Gary Nixon about it at Donington once, when he used to sort of came over to Gopher for Nicky Hayden for Nicky's first couple of seasons, the old superstar dirt tracker, and he said these guys are going too fast to party, and because when he was racing, they'd be doing all kinds of stuff, but the nights before races, the nights after races, and they were having a wild time, with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and I would much rather have raced then, despite the dangers and whatever, because you would have had a great time. It was just a non-stop party, whereas now it's just, in those days, everybody went racing to escape work, I think, and now racing has become a job of work. It's become less and less romantic and more scientific. And that's just the way it goes. How you can't stop that happening. It's just a process. You could argue that all of life has gone a bit like that. It's become less romantic and more scientific.
Matt, I mean, Valentino's had an incredibly long career, and he's had so many impacts on the sport. But what is it that has impressed you most about it? I mean, there's the longevity of his career. There's the fact that he's won on a 2-stroke 500, a 990 and 800. He's won races on the 1000cc format. The fact that he developed, he kept on changing and developing, changing his style and learning and all the rest of it. What is it? I mean, sort of, and related to that, what do you think his biggest achievement is, and what do you think his legacy is?
Well, his you got it right there. I mean, his longevity, obviously, 26 seasons. I mean, no one's done Formula One that long, or even Grand Prix, Formula 2, Formula 1. I mean, I think Kimi Räikkönen's the longest season, 20. And you cannot, just from a danger point of view. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, motorbike, because it is mostly pretty safe, apart from Moto3. Nowadays, people don't understand how dangerous it is, and how most of these guys are living in pain most of the time.
Yeah.
Most of them are injured all the time. Even if it's just a kind of, they've fallen off at 70 miles an hour and they've bashed themselves about a bit, they haven't broken anything, that's going to hurt for a week or something. You know what I mean? So to live with that pain for that long is remarkable. To want to go and risk your life for that long, when you've got 200 million in the bank or whatever, it is just remarkable. Most riders need to kind of have a reason to race, and that's for gold and glory, basically, isn't it? He's got enough gold, he's got enough glory, I mean, to carry on just basically wanting to keep racing because he loved race, just because he gets off on the buzz of riding a motorbike is remarkable. And he's to ride everything from 125s, 250s, 500s, 800s, 990s, 1000s, superbikes, the 8 hour. I don't think there'll ever be a career like it. I don't think. And on top of that, his ability to cross into the mainstream, to make grannies watch racing, to make kids watch racing, to half the grid just grew up as worshipping Rossi. I mean, it's kind of pretty much impossible to take it all in, really. It's such an, if you kind of see the whole circle of what he's achieved, both results wise and his effect on people all around the world. Is there was that refugee boat in Australia some years ago that got towed into harbour. I think some refugees coming in. And it was a fishing boat, and it had all been painted in Rossi colours, hadn't it? Yeah, and with a big 46 on it, and you just went, "Ma, this is insane." I mean, obviously it's a very sad story, these refugees or whatever, but you just, how can you even begin to quantify that kind of reach, that kind of effect that he's had on people? For somebody in Indonesia, a fisherman in Indonesia to paint his whole boat in Rossi colours. I mean, it's insane,
Another break on the Paddock Pass podcast, and we come back at the end of this. We'll give our final thoughts on Rossi and get a few more little bits of insight from Matt as well. Welcome back to the Paddock Pass podcast, and on today's show, like we said, we've got Mat Oxley for Valentino Rossi, all his races. That's out now. And Adam, just for you, obviously, when you first came into the paddock in, I think it was 2002. The first race of the four-stroke era was your first race with Dorna. Like, what was your impressions whenever you saw Rossi?
Actually, Steve, my first Grand Prix was the 2001 Japanese Grand Prix in Suzuka. So it was a pretty good one to pick, really. I can remember it was the first Grand Prix I was doing working for Dorna, and it's not quite the media behemoth it is now in terms of television production and whatever else. It was a very small crew, a very small setup in terms of infrastructure in Suzuka at that time. And I remember there being a real buzz about the place because of what was going on between Biaggi and Rossi. It really was kind of like the awakening of, like Matt, and Dave referred to, this jewel that, the 500s have been missing. So that was my first race, really, before I kind of diverged off into covering like MXGP and the Motocross World Championship. But I mean, I wanted to ask Matt, really, because, the volume of races that you had to work through. I mean, I think Rossi had some ridiculous statistics of like 8 seasons or more where he was on the podium more than 10 times. I mean, his numbers, of course, are etched in the history of the sport. What was it like kind of, I mean, the book is published by Avro Publishing. I mean, you put out on Twitter as there's a great story in the background and the name of the company that have put this thing together. And it has been like a labor of love. I just wondered, what it was like sometimes having to create all those stories around, repetitive podium results, especially like in the Repsol Honda years. And whether there was really kind of one race that stood out where you thought, oh, that's easy, I could dash that off in my sleep because it made such an impact. And also to extend the question to the guys on the pod.
A race that stands out, God. Well, I mean, yeah, Suzuka 2001. Because it was, again, going back to this sort of thing where Rossi had this almost superhuman things happened around him to kind of help him create the story, So we went to Suzuka in 2001. Honda had to get 3 wins, 3 more. They were on 497 wins at the end of 2000. So the first race of 2001 was the Japanese Grand Prix at Honda's home circuit, and so they need 3 races to get to 500 wins. So if they win all 3 races, they win 500 wins. First manufacturer ever to achieve it at their home circuit in the Premier class with Valentino Rossi. I mean, you couldn't, a PR woman couldn't dream of a better sort of setup. And Rossi's like, well, there's no way that Honda are going to win the 125 race because Aprilias are way faster around Suzuka. But Tokotomi, was it? I can't remember. Won the 125 race, and then Kato went on a Honda, and then Kato went out and won the 250 race on a Honda. So there it was, straight away. Rossi was like, wow, and he did it, won the 500 race at Honda's home circuit, blah, blah, blah. So you just had these kind of, that was one of those moments where, yeah, everything came together to kind of help blow his legend up into even bigger than it was. Other races, oh my God. I mean, well, obvious one, when he won Phillip Island with the 10-second penalty, when he just sort of realized he got a 10-second penalty and said, right, well, I'm just going to beat them all by more than 10 seconds, and just sort of disappeared, and we're like, oh, okay, so that's how he can ride really when he needs to. So that was, but like I said earlier, the important thing when you're doing something like this is it could end up, and I hope it hasn't, to being incredibly turgid, race report, but somehow you've got to keep the kind of knit it all together and keep a flow from one to the other. You know, I hope I've achieved that. I don't know if I have. Like I say, I'm bored of the book. I haven't looked at it yet. So, yeah. So that's the thing with a book like that, is keeping it all sort of dancing along and having sort of features in between that kind of break it up. So interviews with Carlo Pernat, interviews with Alex Briggs, interviews with Jeremy Burgess, interviews with Lucio Cecchinello, and so on. Yeah, I think the book in total is 120,000 words, which is a kind of terrifying number of words. But, you know, if you write a book, and I've written quite a few now, it's you just think, oh, I can't do this, it's ridiculous. But then you sit down and you break it up into chapters and you start working out a format, and then you sort of break it up into little pieces, and it becomes a lot more manageable. But, you know, if somebody says to you, right, you've got to write 120,000 words, you just go like, you just shoot yourself, you know.
Yeah, because
as to the history of the company, Evro Publishing, which is EVRO, so Eric Verdon Rowe, who owns the company, his granddad started Avro Aircraft, who designed and engineered the Avro Lancaster, obviously a very famous Second World War bomber, and also the Avro Vulcan, which was, you know, one of the kind of planes of the Cold War, this ridiculous, about the size of a small town, you know, and made just the most noisiest thing you've ever heard. So that's quite a cool backstory behind the publishing company.
Yeah, I was going to say, Matt, as well, because one of the things for me over the last years, like, just to go back to Ad's question about like those memorable races, I really remember whenever we went to Phillip Island in 2014, that was actually one of those standout ones for me, because if you think back to 2013 when Rossi won at Assen, it was just, finally, he's managed to win again. That's great. We might be here at the last race that Valentino Rossi wins, and it was special. And then he went on, he won at Misano in 2014, and you thought, oh yeah, you know, this is potentially that last race victory. And then when he won in Phillip Island, you thought, fucking hell, you expect him to win races going forward. And like 2015, when I was working with MCN, went out to the tests, and it was the first time that I had been in the paddock, and I saw Rossi walking through the paddock like the Rossi from the stories that you always heard from all the other journalists, or what you saw on telly whenever you were a kid. And he expected to win races. He was going in to win a world championship, and you could see a change in him almost overnight. And he went into that season, and I remember writing from Sepang 1 that I thought he was going to be a title contender. I almost put him down as a title favorite just because of that air of confidence he had. And it just went to show just how quickly it can turn for a rider like that. He expects to win. He's done it all the way through his career. And after a period of time where he really struggled, all it took was those couple of wins. And that's what gave him that longevity, because even those last couple of years that were tough years, 2020, he could have won a couple of races that year. You know, there was still that spark that could have brought it all back for him. And I think, you know, that winter of 2014 really reminded me of just how quickly we can write people off. But when they've got that talent and they've had all that success, you write them off at your peril.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of time when I kind of thought, wow, he is getting back to his best was Misano 2014, as you said, where he was racing Marquez for the win. That was the year where Marquez won the first 10 races, you know. So, you know, he was on his way to his second world title. So there was no doubt that he was the best guy. And they were racing for the win there. And Marquez crashed trying to stay with Rossi. And you just thought, okay, you know, that basically says that, the best rider in the world is falling off trying to beat him. That means that he can be world champion again, definitely.
Yeah, that whole 2015 season, I mean, the end really ruined it, because there were some fantastic races in that. And you saw that, I mean, the Phillip Island, what was it, 2003? That was a measure of just how much faster Valentino Rossi was than everyone else, how fast he really was. Then Laguna 2008, when he beat Casey, was like, this was him showing that he found a way to beat a rider who was on a faster bike, who should have beaten him. but he found a way to do it together with Jerry Burgess, obviously. And then 2015, there were those races where he found ways of actually beating people. Where he found, Argentina, where he beat Marquez, and Assen 2015. The end of that race was absolutely fantastic because Mark had been setting that pass up all weekend, diving in sort of really tight to the final chicane, and it was obviously going to try something there. And Rossi knew that was going to happen, took account of it and took advantage of it and won. And it was just Marquez's reaction in the press conference afterwards told you just how badly he felt he'd been beaten by Valentino at that point. So, those were those most memorable. And it's a shame that, as I like to say, Andrea Iannone ruined his race for him at Phillip Island in 2015.
Yeah, obviously enough. If you want to listen back to anything about that 2015 season, we actually did a couple of lockdown episodes on it last year. So episode 145 and 146 were about that 2015 season. Neil, what about you?
Yeah, 2 years ago, Steve. We're in 2022 now, of course. But yes, I would say, it's an obvious one, but just, welcome 2004, just for the sort of that achievement. You've gone through the whole preseason. It was kind of wonderful how it had shifted and how Rossi kind of played it as well, because he was at the end of 2003 saying, I think we need to maybe give myself and Yamaha half a season to sort this bike out, and maybe if we can be winning by the end of 04, basically the aim is 05, the championship. And then as the tests went on at the start of 04 preseason, you started hearing whispers that, he's actually really fast. But then you thought, okay, well, can he be consistent? And I think Rossi in his book actually said they had a race simulation at a test in Phillip Island, and I think they were maybe even faster than he was the previous year on the Honda. And he was thinking, okay, but he made a point of not telling anyone or not releasing the sort of the time he did during that race simulation. And then I think there was a preseason test at Jerez. And again, you're just thinking, can he actually do this? And it was it was kind of one of those. It wasn't a real brawl, that fight with Biaggi that he had. It was more tense. He was leading. Biaggi was just trying to get by in any way. And I can't remember a race where the lead rider has looked so kind of ungainly and uncomfortable on the bike. It was clear that bike at that time was not ready to win. And those guys were 10 seconds ahead of Gibernau in third. They were just in a class of their own. And Rossi still found a way to beat Biaggi. It was just a kind of Herculean achievement. And I still think the only time that a rider has won consecutive races on different makes of bike in the Premier class. So, that achievement stands alone as a totally unique feat.
Writing the book, I kind of interviewed a few people, Burgess and Briggs, for example, who were obviously, part of fixing the Yamaha. And you won't believe how easily they did it. I'm not going to tell you here. People have to buy the book. But chapter and verse, what they did to the bike and how obvious the problems were. That Burgess and Briggs, they just couldn't. The problems that the bike had were so obvious, and they fixed them in a day or two. Just with settings and ride heights and suspension settings and so on. Literally, just really, you got the bike set up like this. Why don't we just do this? Oh, it works now. Awesome. And Yamaha has I'll tell you one of the things that Rossi said, whenever I shut the throttle, the bike's still pushing me into the corner. So this is like the first step, probably after his first couple of runs, the bike's still pushing me into the corner. So they looked on the data, and sure enough, he shut the throttle on the brake, but the throttle's still, because obviously it's a electric ride-by-wire throttle. So the throttle's still picking up as he's going into the corner. And they're like, why is that doing that? And they're like, for some reason they had the front brake pressure was connected to it was actually triggering, it was turning the throttle on. And the guy hit the front brake. And they're like, what? And then, we'll just disconnect that parameter. And that's problem solved. And it's like, hang on, you've been racing like this, and so is this why Barros crashed 98 times last year? When Barros was the lead rider, because every time he hit the brakes and the fucking revs picked up and he lost the front and crashed. But none of the other riders have been able to work that one out. You know, I mean, it's just, and there were a few other things like that which are just mind-boggling. You know, how simple they were, but Yamaha hadn't been able to fix them until he came along.
Yeah, because I thought that was one of the most interesting things actually, Matt, that I read just reading through the book, and it was new information for me. And I think that's one of the good things whenever you get a book like this. There are some things that, you know, people didn't know about from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and you do tend to have it. It's a good encyclopedia to be able to look back on, to be able to look through it. And obviously enough, it's been a labor of love for you at times, and then it's been a chore at other times. But whereabouts can everyone get the book?
The publishers are Evro Publishing. I think the best thing to do, so I think best thing is just to Google Valentino, all his races, Evro Publishing, which is EVRO, and that will just take you to the website rather than give people a web address. I think just Google the book name, Valentino Rossi, all his races, Evro Publishing, EVRO, and that will take you to the website. I think so you can get it from Evro now, or you can wait until the end of this month or early February to get it from Amazon.
We can put out the link also, you know, when we spread the show on social media. So if you're getting your Paddock Pass podcast from, you know, Twitter or wherever, then we'll try and put the link as well to the book.
Cool, thanks.
We're obviously coming to the end of the show, man, but just one quick question to ask towards the end. You obviously mentioned some of the names from Rossi's career that you interviewed to research the book, and I just want to know who was the most enlightening, who was the funnest, and why was it Carlo Pernat?
Oh man, yeah, Carlo. Yeah, I mean, he's a bad man, but I love him. You know, he's fantastic. I mean, he's. There's no one else like him in the paddock. He was fantastic to talk to, but also Alex Briggs. You know, who's obviously been there since the beginning. You know, as Steve just said, you know, the thing about when you're writing a book is you're talking about 10, 15 years ago, and you find out all the secrets. You know, there's no way in 2003 or 2004 or 2005 or whatever, around that period, that anyone would have revealed what they'd done to fix the Yamaha. But now it's sort of ancient history, isn't it? So yeah, they're quite happy to come up with these secrets. So that's the exciting thing. So I enjoyed Cecchinello, Pernat, Briggs, Burgess. I just love speaking to anybody who knows their stuff about motorbike racing, basically.
What are you doing with us?
What am I doing with myself?
Obviously, I mean, you're writing this book because it's the end of Valentino's career, and Valentino's he's dominated the sport. Like you said, he was bigger than the sport at one point. We saw that there were a couple of times when it looked like Valentino Rossi was about to retire, the Dorna actually realized they had to do something about the sport. And in the end, the whole switch to, you know, via CRTs and single and spec ECUs and all the rest of it, they've created this incredibly exciting championship now. But how do you see the future of the sport without Valentino Rossi? Because, you know, the proof 2022, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and it's the first season genuinely without Valentino Rossi there.
It's going to be really interesting. I mean, I think it's lucky for Dorna, for anybody wanting to make money out of the sport. So that includes us, I suppose. That Rossi had a kind of quite a long downfall. If he'd retired, you know, if he'd at the end of 2015, for example, if he said, "Bugger this, I've been," you know, he obviously thought he'd been shafted and thought, right, I'm off. I think then there would have been a dramatic, you know, collapse in viewing figures. But because he's kind of the last few years, he's been on a kind of downward trend. I think a lot of people have kind of gone, sort of slowly switched their allegiance, found somebody new to cheer on. So, you know, obviously I hope it doesn't have too much of an effect, but we're just not going to know until it actually happens. I mean, will we lose 10% viewing figures? Will we lose 15, 20? Will we lose 5? I don't know, but it'll certainly be different. I'm actually looking forward to it because I'm, you know, I'd loved having him around. 26 years was great, but it was time to go, you know, and I'm quite looking forward to the post Rossi era, just to see what it's like, you know, and yeah. I mean, my number one hope of all is that Marc Marquez is going to be fully fit, because before he arrived in 13, I was getting quite bored of MotoGP. During the 800 years, it'd been a nightmare. The racing just follow your leader because of the way the bikes were. And I was like, I've nearly had enough of this. And then Marquez came along and tucking the front in every corner. And it's like, whoa, this is so exciting. I just don't know what's going to happen next. So I really, really, really hope Marquez is going to come back. That's my number one hope for the season. And, I mean, from the point of view, how many fans are watching it and so on, really, that doesn't bother me. I'm there because I want to be there, and I like watching it. I like talking to people, and I like writing about it. I don't really care how many other people do, up to a point, as long as there's enough people to sort of help me pay my mortgage, I was there during the boring years of Mick Doohan, but I kind of I enjoyed that from a different. There was still lots going on, and Doohan was fascinating in his own way. So, if people want to leave, it doesn't bother me at all. I'll carry on enjoying it, and I think also there is that sort of thing. You were talking about negatives of Rossi. I would say that a lot of people that came in and became huge fans of Rossi, but not really knowing anything about motorbike racing. And, I'd much rather have fans that are really into the racing and kind of want to understand more about it, and why is this like that, and why is like that, rather than just people who are just to scream in support of one rider, So if all those, people that supported him and nothing else depart, it doesn't bother me at all. But it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what it's like. But I'm actually really looking forward to it.
Obviously, for us on the Paddock Pass podcast, one of the big metrics we have for being able to track just how interested fans are in Rossi, and only Rossi, will be our Patreon subscribers. So check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast, where for $10 a month, you can become a Paddock Insider and get lots of additional content through the winter tests, and then also through the course of the season. That's going to be something we're going to be keeping an eye on all the way through the year, just to make sure that everyone's able to get good value for that. But obviously enough, this brings us to the end of today's show. Matt, like you said, the book is Valentino Rossi, all his races. A Google search will take you to Avera Publishing, and you can check that out for, I think it's £50 for the book, and it's well worth it for any MotoGP fan, never mind the Valentino Rossi fan. So Matt, a big thank you for joining us on the show today.
Oh, thank you. It's been great fun. Good to talk to you all, and online, and I hope to see you all at Sepang or in Qatar. You can all buy me that's my price for this, is you can all buy me a beer in Qatar. So that's about $2,000, isn't it? Awesome.
I won't be in Qatar, Matt, so I'll get you whenever it's a nice cheap beer somewhere else. But obviously enough, the Patreon money will go towards the Mat Oxley beer fund for Qatar, so that'll probably bankrupt the show. So this could well be the last couple of months of the Paddock Pass podcast. But it's been a good run for us. We're well over 200 episodes, and we've a lot planned for the rest of 2022. So obviously we've had a couple of weeks off just for the new year, and David's obviously been full of New Year cheer, but for Neil, it was probably a little bit too much New Year beer. And Adam, it's hopefully going to be a little bit quieter for you now, and you can get away from the in-laws. But big thank yous to all of you for joining us on the show as usual. And we'll be back next week with another episode of the Paddock Pass Podcast presented by Renthal Street and Fly Racing.